On today's show, we have Jake Madison from Locked On Pelicans, and we're going to talk about Anthony Davis in relation to Evan Mobley. Let's dive in.
You are Locked On Cavs, your daily Cleveland Cavaliers podcast.
All right, I'm Chris Manning. I cover the Cavs and the NBA for outlets like SB Nation, Cleveland Magazine, and the Just Basketball Show. We have Jake Stevens, as always, on production. Special guest today, Jake Madison. We have too many Jakes. It's Jake World Order out here. He's the host of Locked On Pelicans. You should be listening to that if you aren't already. I want to tell you that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And I want to thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. Remember, we are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Jake, here's where I want to start with this. Tell me if this premise is incorrect. And if it is, well, I'll pivot on the fly. When I was thinking about Evan Mobley, I think his archetype as a player is similar to AD in that they are both guys whose primary value is defensive, where they can be overwhelmingly great defensively. And the question is, how much can their offensive game get in balance to make them threats in the playoffs? We have obviously seen Anthony Davis have really, really high successful offensive playoff moments. There are also times where it hasn't gone the way. I think more so with the Lakers than the Pelicans, but it has happened. That to me, when I look at Evan Mobley and I look at what he is, that to me is both a template and some things you would maybe want to turn out differently if you can figure them out in your team context and with his development. Is that an unreasonable kind of parallel that I'm drawing here?
No, I don't think it is. I think you're on the right track with a guy like Evan Mobley. I wouldn't necessarily say that's exactly how Anthony Davis's career has gone, but I think when you look at Anthony Davis and in particular who he is now, right? Like that's the role you want him to play. You want him to be the defensive guy and fit in like just enough offensively if we're being realistic about him. Like that's not the dude who's going to lead the Lakers to another title. He needs another player to kind of carry that offensive burden, offensive load from that. And that's partially because both of these guys are big men and not a big man in the sense of Joel Embiid, Julius Randle, Zion Williamson with their style of play kind of being perimeter focused. So I think when you look at Evan Mobley, it's like, yeah, he should be what we want Anthony Davis to be, even if Anthony Davis isn't always that kind of guy.
Here's their stats through the first 2 years of their career. I'll look these up. Did a comp thing on Stat. That was pretty fun. Mobley through 2 years, 148 games, 15.6 points per game, 8.7 rebounds, 66.9% from the line, 53.3% from the field, 2.7 assists. AD, 131 games, 17.3 points per game, 9.1 rebounds, 1.3 assists per game, 2.3 blocks, 51.8% from the field. Davis had a much higher usage rate. They had a very similar true shooting percentage. Mobley had a higher assist percentage. The offensive advanced numbers distinctly favored Anthony Davis as an offensive player by a pretty significant margin, which isn't super surprising, but we can talk about why. But when you look back, Jake, at AD's first 2 years, what was he? What were the Pelicans doing with him? What were they doing with him on the offensive end? And what was his balance as a player like?
Yeah, coming into the league, right, he had kind of been the most hype prospect, best prospect since LeBron James, I think you could argue, since, with all of that. And he had a monster year at Kentucky. Like he won every accolade. And when he was coming to the league, I expected him to be like a defensive force and take a while to kind of get going offensively. But the reality was kind of flipped. He wasn't as impactful of a defender as we thought he might be. And the offensive game looked a little bit further along than what we had been expecting in the first place. And when you're comparing those numbers, right, Anthony Davis was the best player on the team. Like he had to carry those early, the first year where they were the Hornets. After that, they became the Pelicans. Like he was the number one guy on all of those teams that he's been on. Is Mobley the third option for the Cavs right now behind, certainly behind Donovan Mitchell, but is he 2 or 3, right? So he fills a different role. So you wouldn't expect him to have the kind of offensive game and the offensive numbers, right? And you mentioned the usage rate. That's the kind of that right there with everything. So Davis was further along offensively than I think we were expecting. That also might have been out of necessity. He just kind of had to. And one of the things that really jumped out early on in his career was his mid-range jumper is pretty good and it was relatively unstoppable, right? Like Kevin Durant pulling up from mid-range with the length that they have. It's not like you can contest that or anything. You just got to kind of hope that guy misses. And AD's, particularly in a pick and pop situation, was really there and something that he was able to go to reliably right off the bat, and being kind of, a pick and roll lob threat, but also being able to stop, pull up, and drain a jumper is really going to help you if you're a big man trying to add versatility to your game. So he had that coming into the league, and I think that's part of the reason why some of those numbers maybe look a little bit more in favor of Anthony Davis, along with the usage rate and being the number one option on the Pels.
The mid-range jumper thing, I think, is the perfect way to look at this, because Mobley on offense sometimes will take it, but he's not super willing. And when you go back and look at some of the stuff, he was more willing. And even to this day, the jump shot thing with him is a very big part of what he is or is not as an offensive player. It has come and gone, and obviously kind of peaked in the bubble. Mobley hasn't had that yet. And to your other point about the usage rate, Mobley's usage rate dipped from year 1 to year 2. That is so rare. Like I didn't go and pull the exact numbers on this, but it is rare for someone to be a top 3 pick, to be to my opinion, should win Rookie of the Year, and have their usage rate dip from year 1 to year 2. That doesn't happen. Usually it grows. You get chances to make mistakes. Mobley's circumstances on offense have meant he's not getting to necessarily play through mistakes in the way someone like A did, which was out of necessity for them. But the Cavs have Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland. He's not going to get those opportunities.
Yeah, I think when you look at that, right, like that's kind of the big thing for him. I kind of view him, and I don't follow the Cavs super closely, as potentially the third option here, second option at best. So it's not quite a one-to-one comparison of Anthony Davis. Davis came in and cool. He's playing with Ryan Anderson and like one or two other guys his rookie year that maybe you have heard of. Like, of course he's going to get the ball a ton. What else were you going to do there? Even though they kind of babied him during that season. So when you have that being the case, like, okay, he's going to go out and he's going to play and he's going to be able to kind of do his thing, make mistakes, work through it, and it'll be fine because they weren't expected to be in contention the first couple of years, given everything that they were kind of going through with a rebuild at the period of time. So cool. You give him the ball. You kind of go trial by fire. Certainly if you're kind of looking at like the development plan for him early on in his career with that mid-ranger, you wanted him to play a little bit more closer to the basket. You wanted him to put on more muscle to be able to kind of back down guys, post up guys, to rebound a little bit better. He wasn't an amazing rebounder his first couple of years. And when I look at Mobley, he is, and that's a great thing. Defensive rebounding counts as defense. So, you wanted him to kind of get to maybe not the size of Mobley from like a physicality standpoint, but have more physicality to his game to not just be a mid-range guy, because look, there have been times the bubble when it's falling for him. And then if he falls in love with that too much and it's not, he becomes now a largely at times ineffective player.
Before we go into break, I pulled up this roster for AD's rookie year. Number one, I apparently forgot that he played for the Hornets. So it was the Hornets at the time. So my apologies on that. Here, this roster is, well, number one, Robin Lopez is on that team. He just played for the Cavs. So there's some connective tissue there. Austin Rivers, Donald Sloan.
Pick that draft.
Yes. You have Ryan Anderson, you mentioned, Lou Admonson, Al-Farouq Aminu, Hakeem Warwick, Grievous Vasquez. This is just, and Monty Williams is coaching that team. Dell Demps is what a world that team must have been.
Vasquez played the most minutes on that team. Like, think about how bad that team was or wasn't going to be good when that's the case.
34.4 minutes per game for Grievous Vasquez. Goodness gracious. That is very different than Darius Garland putting the minutes and point guard for your team when you're rookie. And after the break, we're going to look at how AD broke out on offense. What was the build for him, so to speak? But first, got to tell you about our friends at FanDuel. FanDuel, by the way, is the official sportsbook partner of Locked On. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs because right now, new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Jake, a bet I feel great about right now that I made right when FanDuel came online in Ohio. I got the Nuggets at plus 800 with one of my free bets to win the title. Feeling great about that. Feeling great about that.
As you should. Right, as you should.
They've given me cash out options of late, and I'm like, you know what, $40, but I get 80. I feel very good about the fact that I might, even if they get Boston, I would be happy about that. FanDuel, by the way, has awesome promotions to check out. It is safe and easy to use. You get paid instantly as well. And if you want to set limits every month, you can do that too. That's how I decide to use FanDuel in a smart way. There's no better place to bet all the play of action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thanks for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. I'll be back tomorrow. We have a Locked On NBA insider, Howard Beck, to talk about Kobe Altman and lessons from the Cavs playoff loss. So be tuned for that. Jake, just, you are the headliner. Howard Beck's it's just like reverse opening act kind of situation. Like he's playing after the main event, to be clear.
Yeah, of course. I love it.
Yeah. I mean,
how it should be, totally.
We're Locked On OGs. Howard's just kind of, he's here, he's great, but you're like the Taylor Swift Palooza, and he's like, they got to squeeze in someone after the fact. That's how I'm looking at this.
That's what they call me, Jake Taylor Swift Madison here.
That's tough. That'd be tough. All right. So are you also dating Matt Haley from the 1975? It's an open question. Okay. So what was Anthony Davis's offensive breakthrough like? Like we've talked about his first 2 years. When did the offensive side of his game really break through the ceiling?
There were a couple of points, right? It was partially just over time. He did get better at playing closer to the basket. That mid-range jumper was starting to fall. He added a three-pointer to his repertoire. While not an amazing thing, he still could hit it reliably enough. And they finally put a good roster around him, or I should say a good enough roster around him. When you have big men like this, and it's an issue in the postseason too for a lot of players, and it's going to be an issue for Evan Mobley given his style of play, but I think they have it solved here. When you're a big, right, you got to get someone to give you the ball. Unless you're a Julius Randle or a Zion Williamson where you're driving from the three-point line and just a freight train going downhill, if you don't have that kind of handle, which Anthony Davis doesn't, and with like a longer kind of gangly body in a sense, right, out of control, not as good of a handle, you can't do that. You're trying to post up. You need someone to make an entry pass for you, and it's a bit of a lost art at the NBA level. So they got a guard in Drew Holiday that just kind of opened things up, just spam pick and rolls all game with Anthony Davis as your lob threat, and the verticality there is a very big thing. They also worked on putting more shooters around him and spacing the court so that it burned teams if you double tuned him down low. And that was a problem his third season, especially. Anytime he touched the ball, they threw two at him, and it was just a disaster, leading to turnovers. Didn't kind of have that passing ability. And you mentioned Mobley's passing stats earlier. Those are exact right kind of numbers you want from a big man like that. You get in trouble, get rid of the ball and kick it to somebody else. And having the ability to recognize that and then the ability to make those passes, I think opens things up. But it's once they really space the court for him and he kind of just realized like, oh, I'm the best player on the court. I'm going to go kind of impose my will and no one can stop me. And you started to realize that he knew what those matchups were. They weren't there all the time, but there's certain big men that he would just really dominate the NBA level. Karl Anthony Towns is one of them, but he'd struggle against a guy like Rudy Gobert. And if you go to that playoff series with the Portland Trailblazers in 2018, where he just dominated, they swept them in the first round. He knew he was better than Yusuf Nurkic, who just could not stop him whatsoever. And so he just kind of took advantage of that matchup. And Drew Holiday was also having a scorching hot playoff series there. And it just opened things up. And when you look at his playoff numbers, that postseason, that series, he's playing closest to the basket in terms of his shot profile, in terms of his shooting percentage from 0 to 3 feet than any other postseason he's had. And that's when he probably played his best offensively, unless you really want to look at the bubble and the jump shooting. which carried the Lakers to a title a little bit. But which one's more sustainable for a big man like that? And I think we've seen it at this point. So it was when he realized his game was closer to the basket, not relying on that jump shot, and just anytime you had that favorable matchup, just go to it and do your thing. That's when he started to kind of break out. The problem is now he doesn't do that nearly enough, and there's tougher matchups for him than in the past, and that's one of the reasons why I think at times you've seen him struggle offensively, and he doesn't have guards that can get him the ball in LA right now.
Yeah, it's tough. Where my brain goes is to ask a question that I think has became kind of a joke in LA, so I'm just sort of speaking now. He's just playing the 5, and then I was watching, I went back and just crushed as much highlight tape as I could of that series in 2018, because the numbers for that playoff series, or in that playoff run in particular, are just obscene from Anthony Davis. Like 30.1 points, 13.4 boards, 54.9% on twos, 2.3 blocks a game. Just like dominant, awesome stuff. Where was this in the saga of Anthony Davis doesn't want to play the 5, he wants to play with a center? And how did that whole thing kind of evolve within that era of his Pelicans tenure?
So he didn't really have a choice, right? Like that year was the year they had DeMarcus Cousins, and DeMarcus Cousins went down with that injury. And so DeMarcus Cousins had been the 5, and all of a sudden now you are left without that. And they traded for Nikola Mirotic during that trade deadline, brought him in. He's not a 5. He's a big that could rebound and shoot and do good enough. But they put him with a court spacing big, and they're just like, you're going to play center, and it's what it's got to be. And down the stretch and in that first round of the postseason, it was a favorable matchup. Like there's that famous picture of Nurkic on the ground, AD standing over him, and then Drew Holiday's pointing and laughing at Nurkic on the floor, which really sums up that series. There was just no answer for him. And so even if he doesn't want to be a full-time center, and he doesn't, he's hated that, the physicality was not something that he liked, he knew he could take advantage of that matchup and just do what he needed to do, and then straight up did that and carried it over a little bit to the next round against the Golden State Warriors, where they lost, but it was more, it's the Warriors, they were going to win, than anything else. He still didn't want to do that full time, but if you look at the postseason there, and basically that year, he's playing more center when they were winning than ever before, and it showed you this is exactly what he needs to do. Like the good thing is, let me ask you this, right, Mobley's a center, right? Are you worried about it being like, oh, he doesn't like that spot, or that's not the best use for him?
No, it is that they have Jared Allen.
Okay, that's fair.
So it is this question of this is where I think the Cavs thing, this is where I think the different situations I think are going to lead to some different outcomes. Mm-hmm. The Cavs have Jared Allen, who they play next to Mobley, and it has formed like a Voltron of arms and length and switchability at your big spots. And I think that has been what has really pushed them forward success-wise. They also don't have the shooting they really need around those two. And Mobley, I don't know if he's going to become a three-point shooter. I think he might get like a midi, and I think that would be huge. We'll talk about that as like a lesson. I think the mid-range stuff does matter for these kinds of players. I don't think he's going to start like sniping threes, right? I don't think that's going to happen. He's not like Wemby or like Dirk, right? Like that's not what he's going to be. What I tend to think is, do you need at some point to exchange for the sake of Evan Mobley's going to get bigger and be awesome rolling to the rim? He took more shots in year 2, even with Allen still there at the rim, than he did in year 1. Is there a point where you need to just say, we have to play him at the 5, and maybe you go get a backup 5, you try to get a bulkier 4 to play with him in this modern kind of NBA? Is that where it needs to go? Because I could, look, 30 is a lot, but I could see that the template of what AD did in the Portland series is a template for what AD did in that Portland series. To me, is a template for what what Mobley could be in a playoff setting if you have the right roster structure.
Right. So it comes down to a question kind of roster construction. I still also think it's a roles thing, right? That AD in the playoffs that year is the number one option. And when you have Garland, when you have Mitchell, is that going to be the case though? Right? Are you looking to maximize Mobley, or are you looking to maximize one or both of the other two? And I think that's where I see this kind of diverging a little bit. I get your comp for sure on him. It's just Mobley, at least right now, isn't the number one option. So how are you looking to kind of build your roster? Do you need more shooting for Mobley? Do you need it for Mitchell? Do you need it for Garland? Do you need it for Jared Allen? And how do you kind of balance all of that? Like, yeah, Mobley could average 30 in a playoff series in the right matchup, but if he's doing that, what's happening to a guy like Donovan Mitchell? And is that where you might lose that series because he's not playing up to his level at the guard position? You get what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
Is it one of those things where the opponent's defensive game plan is like, cool, let Mobley get 30 and we're going to still win this game?
And I think there's like going to be a tug of war, so to speak, is that I think there's a very good chance that the best version of this era of the Cavs is with Mobley as the best player on the team.
Okay.
I think that is a very possible thing. But is that in the next 2 years? Maybe not. The history would say this takes... AD's Portland series was year 6. This can take time. You also have Donovan Mitchell, who's really good, who's one of the top 10 offensive players in the league, a top 15 player in the league. Garland is... I'm very, very high on Garland. They have really good, other two really good guys who want to be at the forefront of good teams. Are they... Is there a, particularly I think with Mitchell, because Garland plays a little bit unselfish in a way that is very helpful to some of this, is Mitchell willing to give up some of the reins to let Mobley cook, for lack of a better word? That is a question, because I think there's a world where Mobley develops and your team is more diversified offensively and more dynamic offensively with Mobley doing that stuff. But does Mitchell, in the way he wants to play, does that push you there? That is like a tug of war that I think we will see as long as Donovan Mitchell is a Cleveland Cavalier.
No, I think it's a valid question, and it's also, you've got to plan for the future too. You drafted one of these guys. He's younger than the others. There's something to be said for having that guy to bring him along and build him up so that he's ready to take over if a departure happens.
Yes. All right. After this, we're going to come back. We're going to talk about the lessons. We're going to start talking about the most sexy shot in basketball, mid-range jumpers. I want to thank you, though, for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. Remember, every day is back tomorrow. We'll have Howard back on to talk about Kobe Altman. Jake, here's my first lesson, and it kind of goes a little bit off to the side of what we've hit on. I think roster construction is maybe the bigger one. I think the first thing I go to is that I think Evan Mobley, to unlock some of the potential here, to do some of what AD can do, I think the mid-range jump shot has to come. I think being able to hit an 18-footer, I think that unlocks DHOs. I think that unlocks just a little bit more action. I think that just will make him a more dynamic offensive player. I think that has to come. I think that you have to just... the Cavs have done stuff where they give him post-ups, and I don't love that as it's just not an efficient way to get him those looks. They make him harder than they need to be. I think you need to find ways to get him going in that way and get him very comfortable in a pick and pop way, even if it's at 18 feet, just to kind of help loosen things up a little bit. I think that has to come if Mobley's going to get somewhere on the offensive end that is a real positive.
Yeah, I think so. Look at bigs, especially for the postseason, which is kind of really what we're talking about. I think here's where it's kind of like a different animal on how teams defend you. Post-up bigs, it works at times, but if you're not Nikola Jokic and have the ability to pass out of that spot at a crazy high level, and I don't see that from Mobley right now, you're going to run into some problems. Either you're going to get double teamed or trapped and you're going to turn the ball over, or as you mentioned, it's as inefficient of an offense that you can run, even if your guy is very good at hitting all of those things. So adding a little, and he's not going to be the type of guy, a Julius Randle kind of guy, right? With that handle where he can just put the ball on the ground, drive, and attack the basket from the 3-point line. So without that, it's a mid-range jumper or 3-pointers, but it's basically a jump shot, and developing something of that, as you mentioned, to run different actions, whether it's a pick and pop, whether it's a dribble handoff, or even to force a defense to switch at that point because, hey, he might be able to do something here and we got to make sure we have someone on him if he wants to get it in the mid post and then try and drive. You've got to have something else to your offensive game, especially if you think he's going to be the number one option in the future, because without that, you're going to need to rely on people getting him the ball. And we've seen that in this postseason if you don't have guys that can make entry passes, your post up big is useless at that point in time. So you have to have that diversity to your offensive game for sure.
The other thing that has come to mind for me is the bulk. AD's a lot bigger now than he was in New Orleans. Was that a thing for him where he got bigger and kind of play like he just isn't as dynamic as he moves now? Like he just isn't. I don't think he moves the same way as he did in the Portland series. It's just not the same guy. Was that a thing that was happening at the end of his Portland tenure? Is this an LA thing? Like where did the bulk and how do you view him just as being a bigger, maybe less fluid guy at this point of his career?
Right. I think that's also part of his reluctance to play the 5 was I need to bulk up and am I going to have kind of the same agility that I've had before? And those were always kind of, it's a balancing act on that sort of thing, even though it makes sense for him to play center and that's clearly his best position. If his body physically can't hold up to that or changes him as a player, are you actually doing the right thing by putting him there? And that's been the problem. He was always bulking up and getting a little bit bigger, a little bit more muscular every single year here. But you can see he's become much more different in Los Angeles than he was in New Orleans. I also think there's a slight decline in his athleticism, probably just from the numerous injuries and everything he's accumulated over his time too. So I think that plays a factor into it as well, but he's not the exact same lob threat and roller that he once was. And I think that's at a detriment to his game at this point. So it's trying to kind of find the right balance of like, what's the size, what's the weight that you want to be at, what's the play style that you're going to be able to do effectively too.
We'll end on this, Jake. When you think of just this comparison, as we've talked about it, has it changed? Like, has your feelings on like what I was getting at, has that changed at all as we've gone through? Is there anything that has come to mind that you want to make sure we say before we get off? We get this wrap this up.
I don't think anything's changed. It was interesting to hear you seeing Mobley as the best player on like a Cavs playoff team. And maybe because I don't cover them on a daily basis and I don't think like far ahead about this team, that wasn't something that I had really thought about before, but it's interesting to kind of plan for the future while also trying to kind of maximize the now with a player like that. Because I look at a guy like Evan Mobley, I think he's kind of in the perfect spot for y'all here, right? Like let him be a defensive menace and a rebounder and don't worry so much about the offensive game because he's got these two other dynamic guards with him that can kind of handle the load of that. But if you need to kind of plan for the future too, how do you start building that out and start adding to his game and developing him? Because I think he's a great fit for the team and everything they've kind of built right now, right? Like kind of anchored the best defense in the league. So yeah, that's kind of where I look at it of like, oh, okay, I see where you're going with this a little bit more so than maybe I did in the beginning. And I can see the comp for AD really starting to kind of come to the forefront there.
Where I think this comes from for me is just thinking about this is the playoffs saw Mobley's offensive utility drop off pretty significantly. And you also didn't like, whether it was defensive stuff, whether it was just maybe some bad shit, like whether it was just missing open shots, whatever, Mitchell and Garland on the aggregate were not good enough in that series. And I think part of it was because the Knicks were like, we're going to take you away and dare everything else to work against us. I think with a Mobley who evolves in some degree, that feels less likely to happen when you're back there next year.
No, that makes perfect sense. Like, I get it. That's why, when you have a guy that becomes one-dimensional, and as we said, right, the opponent game plan might be, let this dude get 30 and no one else is going to beat us, but he's also got to be able to get 30, right? Like, if he can't get 30 and consistently burn a team, they're going to be great, cool. We might let him get 30, but he's only going to score 18 points and we're going to win easily.
Let me ask one thing that came to mind real quick. Was free throw and being like a pretty heavy free throw guy ever an AD thing?
Yeah, that's where you really started to see kind of things take off. Like his shooting was pretty consistent the first couple of years in the league. It was when he realized like, oh, I'm better than most people around me. I'm more athletic. I can get to the rim. I can score and I can get fouled and go to the line. That becomes a big part of his game and the reason for some of like the points per game increases and things like that.
Yeah. All right. Thanks again to Jake Madison for coming on. Jake, you can find him on Locked On Pelicans, where he's got the Jose Alvarado, Grand Theft Alvarado jersey behind him right now. It's a wonderful YouTube background. Fascinating times as always with the Pelicans. I am perpetually fascinated by the New Orleans Pelicans, Jake. Every time there's some Zion stuff, the first thing I do is cue up Locked On Pels, because boy,
there's always some Zion stuff here, so more coming.
I am fascinated. So check out his pod. Thanks again to Jake Stevens for producing. Back at you tomorrow with more Locked On Cavs.
North Star's my